You can call me a cynic if you like, but it's looking increasingly likely by the day that the only thing big about Victoria's big housing build was its announcement.
Victoria's big housing build.
$5.3 billion allocated for 12,000 new social housing units.
I've talked about the big housing build a bit in the past. It's even starred in its very own video, although it's a bit of an underground deep cut. Announced in November 2020, Victoria's $5.3 billion big housing build program was going to build 12,000 social and affordable homes in total, of which 9,300 of those were flagged for social housing. It was a big sounding announcement with a big sounding dollar figure attached, but the reality was that investment in social housing in Victoria was well overdue. Victoria has had a long track record of underspending when it comes to social housing. When you allow a problem to fester thanks to chronic underinvestment, it can be easy for a big dollar figure to get quickly swallowed up without making much of a dent in the problem. And that's exactly what we've seen from the big housing build. Despite the $5.3 billion budget, the reality is the amount of social housing stock in Victoria has barely budged. Sure, the amount of social housing in Victoria has trended upward in the past decade, but let's be honest, that's a trend barely perceptible to the naked eye. There has been a 3.5% increase in the number of social housing dwellings in Victoria over the course of a decade. I'm talking the 2013-14 financial year through to the 2022-23 financial year, but that increase is well below the state's population growth. The Victorian Auditor General's Office was quite polite when describing the number of social housing dwellings in Victoria as remaining largely steady from June 2017 to June 2023. We'll need to wait until later this year for the annual Friday night dump, another deep cut, before we can get figures for the last financial year, but I wouldn't be holding your breath for a massive increase. With the amount of social housing stock in Victoria hovering around the 86,000 mark for a decade, it's worth pointing out at this point that, according to the Victorian Auditor General's Office, there were over 60,000 households on the social housing waiting list as of December 2023. If Victoria holds 86,000 homes, yet there's still another 60,000 households on the waiting list, you can see the problem, right? As many groups, including the Community Housing Industry Association Victoria, have pointed out, Victoria has the lowest percentage of social housing of any state or territory in Australia. And the big housing build alone is not even enough to bring the state up to the social housing national average. To bring the state up to the national average of 4.5% of homes being social housing properties, Victoria would need to build an additional 6,000 social housing properties a year for the next 10 years. I guess those grim figures are what years of sustained government apathy get you. We're now into the fourth year of the 4-year program that promised 12,000 homes, and from all accounts, things are running a little behind schedule. Well, 3 years behind at least, not to mention the projects that have been quietly deferred to cut costs. Homes Victoria have been quick to point out that despite reports, the same number of homes will be built. It's just a shift in strategy, a change in how the homes will be delivered. Essentially, Homes Victoria have acknowledged that they're 3 years behind schedule, but also that in order to deliver the promised 12,000 homes within the $5.3 billion budget, they'll need to reduce the number of homes they build themselves on publicly owned land and instead increase the number built and managed by various community housing providers. This then seems to have given the Victorian Government the green light to sell off even more public land. Rather than prioritise public land for social housing, the Victorian Government has developed a nasty habit of selling it off to private developers instead. But the public land sell-off is not a surprise for anyone following along as to what's been happening in Victoria. The term fire sale has been thrown around quite a bit, and while the Victorian Government might want to reject it, you have to say that in the context of their actions in recent years, it seems fairly accurate. They started by privatising the Port of Melbourne and then the Land Titles and Registry Office. After selling off those assets, the Victorian Government, channeling the Liberal spirit of Jeff Kennett, turned their attention to Vic Roads.
Vic Roads will be partly privatised, raising $8 billion to help the state government pay off pandemic debt.
The state's Registration and Licensing Authority, privatising it. Sorry, what?
The government denies it's selling off the state's assets.
This is not a privatisation in anybody's language.
Huh?
It's waddling and it's quacking. It's privatisation.
Yeah, I'm with that guy. If it walks like a not quite sure who they're trying to fool, but that kind of reminds me of a saying.
There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, fool me once, shame on you. You fooled me, we can't get fooled again.
But wait, there's more.
They're having a fire sale?
It's a fire sale.
Anyway, you can call it what you like, but the interesting part in the context of housing is that in handing over the keys to Vic Roads, the government also freed up some of the state's prime real estate in blue ribbon suburb Kew. Given we've got a little bit of a social housing problem and this is government land, you'd think this would be the perfect opportunity for the government to build some social housing on it. Nah. Why would you do that when you can sell it off to private developers to cash in on? Under the government's current plan, the land will be sold off to a developer to build 500 homes, with only 10% of those required to be affordable. So zero social housing. And affordable? In Kew? You can Google it, but Kew is consistently in the top 10 most expensive suburbs in Melbourne. So let's hope the government aren't talking affordable by Kew standards. Whilst the Kew site might be one of the larger ones to be sold off in the latest Victorian Government fire sale, it's not the only site. There are plenty of others being sold off too. Some of these are arguably worse given that they were originally earmarked for social housing. Many of these sites are sites that were set aside for big housing build projects that have since been scrapped. Deferred. Hold on, I think we can cut the crap with this deferred business. I think if you've planned to build social housing on public land, as with the sites such as Preston outlined in this article, and then you've sold off that public land to a private property developer to build on, with the only requirement being that a small percentage of the homes be affordable, once you've sold the land off to private developers, that's it, you're done. There's no deferred. It's only my opinion, but I think that public land should be prioritised for public and social housing, not sold off to private developers for them to profit off. It really should be that simple. The big housing build and what's happening in Victoria reminds me of an old saying I think I heard somewhere, that essentially went something like, we should judge people by what they do, not by what they say. And I think you can apply that to governments too.
Action, not words. Yeah, action, not words.
The Victorian Government have talked a big game when it comes to social housing, but their actions don't quite align with their words.
Our big housing build, $5.3 billion in new money provided in last year's budget. That's on top of more than $1 billion that we'd already committed to invest, both in terms of maintenance and new build at the election in 2018. This is more than 12,000 extra units, so new units, an increase of 10% fully on the total social and affordable and public housing stock, if you like. This is more money than has been spent by any government, state or federal, in the history of our nation to boost public, social and affordable housing.
If the Victorian Government was serious about addressing the social housing problem, they'd stop selling off publicly owned land and instead start building social housing on it.